In my language, that's my greeting to you, and I'm very happy and honored to be here. I would first of all like to acknowledge the Haudenosaunee people. We are in their homelands, and it's very important to recognize and honor the indigenous peoples whose homelands we are in. So I acknowledge them and their ancestors and the spirits of the Haudenosaunee people who are with us here today, and to ask them for their for the privilege to be able to speak here today. I am from, I would also like to thank the National Organization of Women and the Native Women's Task Force, who really worked hard, and Kathy Sloan, who worked hard to bring us here today so that we could share and give you some snapshots of different issues that are happening across the rural United States with indigenous women. I am, again, from Kiowa Pueblo, formerly known as Santo Domingo Pueblo. We've assumed back our indigenous name for our community, for our nation. Santo Domingo Pueblo was the name that was given after the Spanish came in. Also, my clans are Oshrach in my language, meaning sun clan. I get that primary clan from my mother's side, and then on my father's side is Mashji, which is the Fox clan, and that's a secondary clan. We get our identities, which really gives us and guides us throughout our lives about who our relatives are and how we're to relate to everyone in the community according to our clan relationships, as well as with our family relationships. I'm very honored to be here to help with moderating this panel and helping everyone to get an understanding of where we're coming from and give you an idea of what's happening in our communities, which are scattered across rural areas in the United States. And when I talk about the United States, I think about the Indian nations that we live in, which should be and are, from my perspective, on an equal footing with the United States. We should ideally have a seat there across the street at the United Nations as indigenous nations, because we were here and we have been here way before the United States came into being. So when I talk about the Indian nations, right now there are about 562 Indian nations, and we all have distinct cultures. We all have distinct languages. We're not all the same. A lot of times people think the stereotype images of what they've seen or learned in school, but we're not all the same. We all speak different languages. Even between the pueblos in New Mexico, where I come from, we have different languages that we speak, and we have different practices that vary from place to place. I have the honor of working in a different pueblo, and they're very different from my own pueblo. One of the commonalities that we have as indigenous women that is often overlooked, because we do live within what we sometimes refer to as living within the belly of the beast, which is living within the United States, which is one of the powers of the world, is that we have the commonality with other indigenous peoples and women, unfortunately, to share the impacts of colonization. Indigenous peoples share the impacts of colonization at varying stages. We have, in my part of the country, in the Southwest, have had over 500 years of colonization that has started with the Spanish when they first came into our part of the country. And other Indian nations have had varying degrees of colonization from the different European settlers who came out to their parts of their country. And a lot of times people were moved off their lands. They were moved into different areas away from their homelands. And we're going to talk about the lands and the importance of lands. and what they really mean to us, because it's not just a piece of dirt, it's not just there for people to take pictures of. Those lands have a lot of meaning to all of us. There's a lot of connection to the lands where our ancestors are buried, where we offer prayers, where we do our ceremonies. And when you're moved off of those lands, when families are displaced, it creates a lot of turmoil, it creates a lot of imbalance for us. And we're struggling with a lot of that. Yet, one of the things I can say about Indigenous women is we are strong. We have endurance. We have memory. We have the ability to survive. And we're going to share with you some of the stories about what's been going on in our communities that have been impacting us ever since the first Europeans came over here from the Spanish, then through the French who came from the north, and then from the various settlers that came on the East Coast, and how they traveled across the country, across different Indian nations, territories, and their homelands. And like I said, lots of people were displaced. And lots of times people, Indigenous peoples, were placed together even on reservations with their enemies, their ancestral enemies, or people that I don't know if they really called them enemies in that time. They were people that lived in different areas, and it was respected that that's your lands and we're not going to intrude upon your lands. I don't necessarily think that they were called enemies. There's a lot of times when we try to translate things into the English language, then it comes across a different way. And when you speak about it in your own language, there may be a different concept to explain the relationship that you have to the other people that were in your what we call now neighborhoods, or close living to your community. Colonization, like I stated, has impacted all of us in different ways. It impacts our whole spirit. It impacts our physical being. It impacts our safety, being safe, and Carmen O'Leary is going to talk about the safety of Indigenous women. It impacts our homelands, as I talked about briefly. It really impacts even our intellectual rights and our intellectual property rights and our DNA. People, there are corporations, there are different organizations out there that are trying to appropriate everything that we have. They are wondering, how did we survive? How have we continued to survive? They look at us as having things that they think that they can use from us, but that's not how we are. There are certain reasons why we have continued to survive and why we've continued to be here. And I'm very, like I said, I'm very glad that we're able to take this time to share with you.
My focus is to share with you some of the responsibilities that Native American women find themselves in today in preserving the homeland and preserving their home site, and some skills that are necessary, that are attendant to either farming, managing what is their piece of the reservation. Hence, Jay, I am from Muskogee Creek Nation. My tribe, we have what are called, translated in English, a tribal town, but it's an Adalwa. And my Adalwa is Thliachka, which is broken arrow. Broken arrow meant that they were actually down by a riverbed or a stand of hard cane, and they would break those and make the arrows from it. My clan is Kacha, or Big Cat, and we were originally from Alabama over to Georgia, and of course the infamous Andrew Jackson saw fit to move Cherokees, Choctaws, Seminoles, and Creeks on the Trail of Tears, and we end in Oklahoma. The tasks that are necessary for women to keep the land tenure system that's been arranged in Oklahoma is very, very an arduous one. And that's a good word, I guess, when I think about the oil and gas and mineral deposits that are there that were sometimes owned by the tribe, but as they divided the tribal land base into individual land ownership, that was called allotments. Most of the land owned by the tribes, 39 tribes in Oklahoma, have been allotted, but out of the 500, and I have 63, Peggy, that can come or go either way, of federally recognized tribes, 39 are in Oklahoma, and I believe that area is the one with the largest amount of tribes. But the array of land tenure systems can be called assignments, which means that the underlying land base is owned by the tribe itself. And there are assignments made for your family that are called either home sites or assignments, and you do inherit that area. So there's many tasks that I think that we oftentimes don't understand when we look at tribal nations, where we think that, oh, if it's a tribal ownership, they own all of the land. Well, probably they own a good bit, but there are individual land tenure systems so that individually owned land is out there as well. What we've seen for women is a task of managing those pieces of ownership, whether it's keeping the inheritance rights correct for the home that's been built, or for the mineral rights that have been leased, or just simply to understand that out of grandchildren, or perhaps through intermarriage, who will take that home site and tend oftentimes sacred sites, burial sites, that falls to the woman in that particular tribe. So the impacting for women, as we will talk and my colleagues on the panel will address, is if there is issues or an issue that a woman has to face and she finds herself as an individual owner, oftentimes getting the ranching and the farming or the revenue producing income wrested away from the spouse, or perhaps the offending spouse, has become problematic. Also knowing how to run a ranch, how to manage cattle, how to take charge of logging interests, or to take charge of a fishing boat, or customary and usual areas of fishing. Those are treaty terms that have been in treaties, long-honored treaties, that may fall to women who oftentimes may not have been skilled or trained in the management of these resources. And we find that the federal regulations have been designed as a result of nation-to-nation treaty making, or statutes, federal statutes passed for creating a reservation or creating certain rights on a particular area of land, are getting to be regulated under what's called 25 CFR. As Peggy referred to the colonization, and as there were treaties and so forth, that created a code, a rule of law that needed to be followed as these various reservations were identified and managed. The Department of Interior is now tasked with implementing those laws, and they will do so under regulatory requirements, 25 CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations. And it's there that we find inheritance laws, requirements for managing leases, requirements for writing wills, and our association, the Indian Land Working Group, our task has found this to be monumental. Remember, people who, for the non-Indian community, you either simply write a will, or you find a way to convey your property, your life's holdings, whether it's in a bank or a different kind of trust setup. Indians usually have what's called an individual Indian money account, an IIM account, and any proceeds from grazing leases, rental for a fish hatchery, or logging income is all managed by the United States of America. If you followed the papers the last 15 years, Eloise Cobell, a champion warrior for women, filed the multi-billion-dollar lawsuit that has recently been settled because of the monumental mismanagement of individual money accounts. I'm from Oklahoma. We know the oil and gas industry was astonishingly inept at getting the right amount of money from each parcel where different gas or barrels of oil were pumped from. We were actually on 60 Minutes, I guess a few years back, 5 or 6 years ago, and I was there with my client who had 7 wells pumping, inherited, and we showed the house without windows and in very poor situations as the wells were pumping in the background. I don't know, Mike Wallace was the one that was there, which led both those of us at the local level and through Indian Land Working Group at the national level to come to these particular things. For women, it has become so important to get a will written, exclude former spouses and former in-laws if that's the intent of the female. They need to know the legal descriptions, which oftentimes they've either inherited their grandmother's area or they don't know what's on it. They need to know all of the leases that are existing that oftentimes the Bureau themselves, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, loses. All cemetery identifications, all final probate orders that the Bureau has probated and perhaps has kept or not. So that woman needs to know if she's taken over running cattle on adjacent tracts of land. That's very important for her to know the location. Individual Indian money accounts, oftentimes those are mismanaged. If there are 7 wells, as we found in Mary Fish's, the income was from 1 and the other 3 were not getting identified. Any kind of environmental issues, obviously leaks, any kind of issues with fishing are monumental when that is your sole source of income. Certainly any kind of turkey farming, any kind of things that pollute the underground water so that you can maintain potable water to your area, and illegal sales, where there was a lack of notice, where there were tax sales, and the property on the reservation was not taxed. Preserving land rights, burial sites, sacred sites is a task for all women. Helen Mitchell is 84 years old, and for our association, she's become an icon. After her second divorce, she said, I'm going to do the logging. Her husband had been doing the logging. She found that the Bureau was not living up to its trust responsibility. She negotiated the legal principle that the United States, as a trustee, has a responsibility to assist individual Indians, obviously Indian women, in managing those resources. Took 2 trips all the way to the Supreme Court. What a woman. Another person is Ernie Werles from Fort Hall, and famous for potato farmers leasing large areas. And she told them twice to take their clutter and move off as the potato farmer left. She got her own bulldozer, picked up and she's also in her 80s, picked up the pipelines, or the water lines, I'm sorry, and the water that comes through, what's that called when they're irrigation, and moved it herself to the edge of her allotment And I just want to say, some people in their 80s, and particularly Indian women, become very, very strong. We'll talk more about this. Thank you.
Dosha Nakhbago meets Lisa Lonefight. My name is Lisa Lonefight, and I'm excited and thrilled to be with you all today. What I would like to begin with is I called home this morning and I was feeling like, you know, I am younger than some of those on the panel, probably not all of them. And, you know, what do I have to say to this group of people about this? I all of a sudden felt like I was 16 years old and one of my aunties here in the front row. And so I put a call out, and my auntie, Diane Medicine Stone, gave me these words I'd like to share with you. She said, "We, the women of the Nueta Hidatsa tribe, are matriarchal society. We, like all women, give birth to the circle of life to our children. A long time ago, when our brother received gifts of horses, etc., he gave them to his mothers and his sisters first. We built the lodges, we grew very large gardens that fed our communities and nourished our families. Today we think," she says, "today I think of my mother, Vivian Lonefight Medicine Stone, who had the wisdom of our ancestors, a very strong and kind woman who loved us unconditionally." Aho. I will begin with that. Again, my name is Lisa Lonefight. I'm an enrolled citizen of the MHA Nation, also known as the Mandan Hidatsa and Sanas Nation. This is the perspective that I speak from. I'm also an indigenous geospatial scientist. Does anybody know what that is? Probably not. My area of research is remote sensing. Does anybody know what that is? How exciting. Okay. So
tell us.
I shall. So have you all used Google? Have you all used Google Earth, where you get to look down and see what color your neighbor's car is? Okay, that's remote sensing. So I'm remotely sensing you. You all are remotely sensing me. So we're looking at each other without touching each other. Okay. I'm honored to be here, particularly honored to be able to be here to speak on the topic of Indigenous women's intellectual property. There's many examples of intellectual property. The one that is closest to my scientific home, as of recent, was the government of India recently sued Monsanto for pirating indigenous knowledge. When Monsanto sought to patent their traditional food of eggplant. Another example is China is investing extraordinary resources in isolating the active ingredients in Chinese traditional plants and medicines. And that's similar to in our communities. We have our own plants on our lands, and we use them for our families. We use them as medicines. We use them as many different things. I can't imagine patenting that, but that is where we're at in terms of indigenous intellectual rights of indigenous people. The problem has reached a point where in India it's now listing traditional biological resources as means of protecting them. This, however, is problematic for indigenous communities, where the ideas of individual ownership may differ from the mainstream. How can you patent a plant or its genetically modified derivative when it is the cultural property of your entire people? When you see the plant itself as having rights and having an identity that is independent of humans. I would like to be clear that the perspective I speak from is not one of an attorney or someone steeped in the law. I also, however, do not want to view the issue of intellectual property of indigenous women as strictly or even essentially a legal one. I believe it has become more deeply entwined with issues of science, technology, education, and access, all areas where indigenous people find themselves underrepresented, and indigenous women more so. My grandmother, Buffalo Bird woman Mahiriwia, was a scientist. Her knowledge of traditional culture and science of the Hidatsa people was unmatched. This knowledge was appropriated and published in a book for which she generally gets only a modest amount of credit and certainly received no financial return. And this book has been in publication for over 100 years. She speaks of our traditional ways to basically do agriculture. We fed our entire communities from our gardens. There is sometimes a tendency to see Indigenous people as isolated from the world, or if not actually isolated, existing behind some thin film or curtain, separate. Of course, this has never been the case, and it's certainly not the case as we now discuss issues of intellectual property in the world of the internet and the World Wide Web, since they are available to us. My grandmother's book, Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden, was digitized and is found on the internet now and is available for free. So I hope all of you who have computers might want to take a look at that. So it's this perspective that I bring today, the perspective of somebody who is fully engaged in the 21st century and its technology. This technology has shaken companies that have controlled intellectual property, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, for centuries. Very simply put, anything that can be digitized will be digitized, and this includes cultural art, stories, plant knowledge, design, and science, traditional intellectual property of all types. So what we are presented with in terms of intellectual property of Indigenous women is a game that has changed far beyond any that we could have imagined even 10 years ago. The information will be digitized, it will be moved, and of those who can adapt to the benefit and those who cannot or won't. I suggest that there are no legal structures that can or will protect Indigenous property or any intellectual property for that matter in the 21st century. We have the ability now not to control our traditional intellectual property and knowledge in a Western way, but we have an unprecedented possibility to comment on it, shape it, structure it, and distribute it in our own channels and for our own purposes. Science always brings a new resource and new challenges. I'm both a remote sensing scientist and an Indigenous scientist. I draw on examples from this experience, although I suggest other disciplines offer similar resources. As a remote sensing scientist, I see that geospatial sciences and geographic information systems represent means and tools for nations, states, and corporate entities to gain information about Indigenous lands, resources, and peoples. This is problematic and potentially subject to abuse without the active, informed, and prior consent and involvement of Indigenous people. On a professional level, traditional, and technical level, GS and GIS represent one of the few means that allow the transnational data gathering and reporting on Indigenous lands, but are seldom in control of Indigenous people. We technically train community-oriented Indigenous people with a background in GIS and GS to control these new tools. This is a problem of education and access. As an Indigenous scientist, I'm reclaiming the heritage of Buffalo Bird Woman Mahidi using the internet and World Wide Web. I continue to work in classrooms with youth and on lands, traditional lands and native lands. I give my students web links for her work and download it. There is no longer a publishing company benefiting in the middle. I believe that is what she would have wanted. She was a generous woman, and that was the reason she shared her knowledge to begin with. This is knowledge that is now accessible to all our grandchildren everywhere, and most importantly, we have the culture, context, and history to make healthy use of it in ways no one else can. We can bring new meaning to her and work in a way that will expand it once again. It has gone from being a static product to a publishing company on an organic living voice, and her work has come fully and clearly home. The world of intellectual property is playing a new game, and I believe the playing field is much more level than it has ever been, and the potential for Indigenous women to win is real, present, and likely. As Indigenous women, we must struggle not to be the music industry of the 20th century, hearkening to dead paradigms. We must instead be the Google of the 21st century. This will not be an easy task. There will be significant barriers to access to new technologies. However we cross the digital divide into democracy of knowledge and information, we may finally benefit once again. After all, we created Indigenous knowledge. Who better to know how to use it creatively, passionately, culturally, and even profitably in the personal survival of our families, communities, and cultural, economic survival of our worlds. I was able to be in touch with a woman, one of my mentors, and her name is Tia Oris Peters, and she's a Zuni woman, and she's works with the 7 Generation Fund. And she gave me some words to share with you today. She said today's International Women's Day. Indigenous women and girls are recognized, remembered, and no longer invisible, and to be thought of not solely as the most vulnerable group, victimized and exploited, etc. On the face of this earth, but also acknowledged as tenacious keepers of tradition, the backbone of communities, the mothers and daughters of many thousands of nations. And I would like to leave you with that. I appreciate your time, and this has been a very short synopsis of a very larger issue. And so I encourage you to look at the 7th Generation Fund, their website. You could also look at my website, which is earthlodge.net, and we could have further conversation in regard to that. Mads.
I'm the director of the Native Women's Society of the Great Plains, Reclaiming Our Sacredness. I met with a group of women, and I wasn't the director in those days, and to form this organization as a nonprofit to organize domestic violence and sexual assault programs in tribal lands. They came together to organize as a nonprofit so we have a bigger voice and we're able to train each other and help each other. Unfortunately, because most of our programs are federally funded, I think out of our organizing members, there's only one that's still working in a program. The rest have went on to other jobs, and mostly that's because of the unstable funding it takes to run the programs. Unlike most programs in your communities or state coalitions, our programs are not federally funded one year to the next. When we do apply for funding, it is competitively. We have to compete with each other, which is just wrong on so many levels. But our organization so far, so good. We're still there. I am here to talk about the problems of sexual abuse and domestic violence. And you know, I'm sure most of the people in this room, if you've read anything on this subject, you've heard the incredible stories that 1 in 3 women, Native women, is going to be victim of some type of violence in her lifetime, and them are the statistics, and that's true. One of the things that I would like you to take away from here is we heard about how strong Native women are. I was born into a tribe that I'm sorry. The value of women was as life givers, and they were held sacred. And their role within the community was respected. And males were also respected in their roles in the value system. One wasn't better than the other one. And I'm really proud to be born into that. And that's what we would like to return to. The legal people that made up the name of like our coalition, Reclaiming Our Sacredness, they didn't think about how that wouldn't fit on most of the legal forms, but they wanted that to be part of our legal title to show what our goal was, not just in our mission statement, but also by naming our organization that. Violence against Native women has been an epidemic in the history of the United States for a very long time. And in 1996, DOJ finally figured out that we have a high number of homicides by non-Native perpetrators. And out in my country, we've known that for a very long time. I can remember when I was little enough, I come from a family where we do ranching, you know. And part of ranching is you do haying, and my dad had this hay lease one year, and it was down on the river. And there was a stucco house. I don't know how many of you guys know what a stucco house is, but it's like a cement, thank you. And what had happened there, they drove by there, is that a Native woman had been killed there, and her perpetrator was not Indian. She brought him back. She went somewhere else and brought him back as her husband. But he had taken a car and had killed her, and there was still a crack in the stucco. So that was my first knowledge of homicide. Yeah, it was big news. But we just thought it was because he was from somewhere else, so it didn't really count. But you know, I don't know to this day what happened to that man. I don't know if anything happened to him. And I need to ask her family about that one of these days. But it's something that really impacted me and stayed with me about what goes on. So what that means is that the human rights of Native women are violated every day, and their lives and their safety are at risk. Some of the recent studies, the federal prosecutors have failed to prosecute 60% of all criminal cases in Indian country. I don't know. It's so complicated and hard to do in 12 minutes, but law is really complicated. Think about this. If someone were to able to come into your homelands, rape you, beat you, and just go on about his daily business with no repercussions, would that be a human rights violation? Okay, that's what we have going on. Right now we have legislative things going on with the Violence Against Women Act, is including retaining criminal jurisdiction back to the tribes over non-Indians. That's been taken away from us for, what, since the 1800s now. And one of the organizations is the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, and they are educating leaders, tribal leaders, and our own congressional leaders, because we have to go to Congress to get that back. And this magazine, Restoration, is a good place for you to be going to get information on that, and it can be found on the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center website. That is one very credible resource you can do to get information about that. But that will be really important, and that's part of one of the action steps that I would like to see happen, is that people call their congressmen and have that happen. We're at 58 senators right now being willing to back that. We need 2 more to make it happen for sure, that it can't go back once it's passed. And we need to get it on the floor and get it out of there pretty soon. The House is going to be another problem. Last summer, I was testifying at the Senate Affairs on, or the Committee on Indian Affairs in the Senate, and I made the mistake of talking about the normalization of sexual violence in our communities. That, you know, people don't do anything about it, it doesn't get reported because nothing happens. You know, women pick up and go on and do what they need to do in their everyday lives, and not in very good ways. There's a lot of complications that come out of that, as we all well know. And so one of the senators said, well, he sent me a question, written question that I need to do a written answer to. If this is a normalization in your communities, don't you need to take care of that? So what does that mean? You know, federal policy impacts our daily lives when we live in our homelands. Okay? If we don't have any kind of jurisdiction over a non-Indian, what can we do about it? If we're waiting for a federal prosecutor to do something about it, and nothing happens, what do we do about that? So the normalization, who is that on, Mr. Congressman? And so we really need to do a lot more about our federal Indian policy than what's happening right now. And we need allies and supporters to do that. I do have to say that our current administration under President Obama and our current Attorney General Eric Holder, they have come up with this, and they are supporting this law, which has never happened in our history, that we would have jurisdiction over non-Indians. And you know, there's a whole lot of things on the tribes that can do it. It's probably only going to be like 176 tribes out of 500 that are going to be eligible to do it, because we have to give offenders all the rights that they get in a regular court. We have to have law-trained attorneys to be the defense attorneys, the judges, so their rights are going to be taken care of. It's just that the tribes are going to have jurisdiction. And you know, a lot of people don't trust tribes to treat non-Indians well. Imagine that. So part of what I would ask you to do is to educate yourself to the problems and become allies and supporters of Native women. You know, don't decide what's best for us, but support what we're already talking about. We have strong women, intelligent women. Peggy, Cecilia Fire Thunder, Terry Henry, Cherokee Nation, Chili Black Bear, Sishangu Lakota, you know, just a lot of Native women who've already decided what we need to protect ourselves, what's going to enhance the safety of women in their homelands. They've decided what we need. You know, they don't need other populations to decide that. Unfortunately, we do need and ask that we have the support of women and other allies, men, so that we can have that pass and that we can better protect women in our own areas. We have a ways to go on that. So, become informed and aid Native women in reclaiming their status of respected and valued and protected citizens in their own nations. And our first priority in that action is to the return of the criminal jurisdiction to the tribes. And that is a real big barrier that really bars full justice to Native women victimized by non-Indians. That has been introduced under VAWA. You know, every federal agency that comes and has anything to do with any kind of policy within our lands, they also need to have some policy about educating about violence against women. And I could go on and on with all of that. We also got the Tribal Law and Order Act passed, which was signed into law, and it now needs to be fully funded to give tribes the ability to provide safety in their lands to women and children. And my time is up, but I'm going to give you some sources. Indian Law Resource Center, I got to that slide, and they have a website. They're out of Montana, but they do a lot of work around indigenous issues. Also the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, Clan Star Incorporated, and we have our own website, Native Women's Society of the Great Plains, as well as we can see us on Facebook. We have Amanda takes work on it, and she just stays up on all the newsreels and things that are happening in an Indian country, and anything to do with the Violence Against Women Act will be in there. On the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, they're the women that published this. They have a PDF file of this whole thing, and then they do a really good job of explaining how that impacts.
I am very honored to be here today. Like Lisa, I was feeling a little out of place. Obviously, I'm very young, from a younger generation, but I do have the experience of life, of living and growing up on the Rosebud Reservation. Backtrack a little bit. My name is Nicole. I am the director of the White Buffalo Calf Women's Society, which is a shelter program located on the Rosebud Reservation. We provide comprehensive services to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, dating violence, and their children. But as I said, I do have the experience of being born and raised on the reservation. I graduated from St. Francis Indian School. I was fortunate enough to be able to leave the reservation and get an education and go home and use that to create a better life for my people, our future generations. Our women, I wanted to start off with a quote, a Cheyenne quote. I think that really, it's true about how our women are perceived among our people, and this quote is just so accurate, and I think it explains everything on how we view women among our people and the sacredness. But this quote is a Cheyenne proverb, and it says, "A nation is not conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground. Then it is finished, no matter how brave its warriors are or how strong its weapons." And I think that's real apt in describing it. Also, I want to talk a little bit about how we got here today as Native people, because, I mean, really, we're here. Our women are suffering. Our women and children are suffering. We have really hard lives. And a lot of the physical and mental illness that we experience is a reaction to a history of, forced oppression and trauma. It's a developmental history of psychological distress that resulted from genocide, ethnic cleansing, and forced acculturation. We as women, we have, and also other, men, but we, Native American women, we have an enormous burden of mental health issues, substance abuse, violence, including high rates of suicide, alcohol, mental health issues. It seems that Native American women appear to be at a higher risk for mental health illnesses than any other cultures. It's really hard to talk about mental and physical health as something separate, because as Native American people, we're holistic people. There is no separation between our mind and body. We are all one, and we are all one with, in my language, Unchimaka, the earth, and everything that is in it. So it's hard to make that distinction between the two. But we, I think that a lot of what we experience today is a direct result of European settlement in our cultures, or in our areas, in our lands. And with that, we experienced a lot of physical violence as women. Our women were raped, our children were killed, our men were stripped of anything they knew of being able to be a protector, to be a provider. And that created a lot of emotional and mental trauma for our men. That was, unfortunately, a lot of it is, we see it as women. We see the effects of it, effects on our men. But so not only the violence, but also there are the issues of, how they forced acculturation on us, the types of food they gave us, and I don't know if many of you are aware of it, and I know they're making great strides in the Department of Health and Human Services now, but a lot of the food that was given to us was, rotten. It's bad food, and it created some really difficult and tough eating patterns among our people, which then resulted in high rates of diabetes, of heart disease, and there's just so many other numerous health issues that were so foreign to us as Native American people that we knew nothing about, and now we're trying to deal with it. And it's difficult because it's something that is so foreign. It's hard to go back to where we were when, it's impossible now. We are governed by forces that are stronger than us, and right now we are working, and I think a lot of work is being done, especially among women, that is trying to create a change, and that is at this level, at a national level, and so that it will, help our people. But I think that one of what I see, and of course it's because of the work I do, but also because I grew up there, a lot of our physical and mental health issues are a result of domestic violence and sexual assault. As Carmen said, unfortunately, statistics say that 1 in 3 women, Native American women, are going to experience some type of victimization. And that's hard for me to deal with. I can honestly sit here and say I can't even count, maybe on one hand, the number of women that I know that can actually say I have never been a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault. I can't. All of my friends, most of my family, they have all experienced it. And so I think, a lot of what our women go through mentally, especially, are a direct result of violence. Our young children are experiences. They're being exposed to this violence, and that's creating a cycle, a pattern of abuse and victimization that we need to stop, that we need to come together, as Carmen said, as women, as allies, and really look at this issue and know that it's impacting not only us as Native American people, but also it reaches further than that in terms of our health care. The Indian Health Service is one of our largest providers for Native American people. And those are just the tribes that actually have an Indian Health Service. Not a lot of them do. It's underfunded, understaffed. We have poor medical providers. And I say this, try to say this in a respectful manner, because my mom is a nurse and she did work at our local Indian Health Service for 35 years. So I do know that there are good people there, but there are also a lot of gaps in the services that they provide, and that really is the medical portion. We're underfunded. A lot of our women who are experiencing violence, they have either broken bones or, there's not a lot of options for them, especially in terms of mental health care. We have, at IHS, Rosebud Sioux Tribe is one of the larger tribes. We have roughly 25 to 30,000 tribal members. We do have 20 communities. We're one of the larger tribes in the United States. But for that many people, we have maybe 4 counselors. 2 of them that are actual doctors and 2 that are just technicians. And that's to cover the men, women, and children. And it's just not enough. We have no other options. We live in a very rural area. There just is not enough medical or mental health services available for our people. But I think, in that, a lot of the women, we experience a lot of stress and anxiety and depression. I think that Native Americans, historically, we hold a really high place statistically in most areas of any type of issues, domestic violence, infant, or the SIDS, the diabetes, the heart disease, the suicide. Our young people are crying out for help. They're feeling helpless. They see this violence. We live in it every day. Not only the violence, but the loss of your parents or your aunt or your uncle because of diabetes or because of other mental health issues that many people take for granted that they can get help with. But a lot of our people don't. They die with these issues and never having received any help. And so our young people, I'm really concerned. We do a lot of work in education at White Buffalo CAF with the youth in the schools and talking to them about healthy relationships and dating violence and sexual assault. And unfortunately, they are all too familiar with these issues because they have already experienced it. We provide services to women that are not 18 yet, a lot of services, and that's unfortunate. But what a lot of women and young women are experiencing is the stress. We're living with intergenerational trauma and grief that is being passed down from our grandmothers to our mothers to us, and we're passing it down to our daughters. So I think it's real important that we look at some of these issues and why a lot of while we have a lot of issues, physical and mental health issues, a lot of it has to do with colonization and the violence that we experience as Native people today. So I think I will just end it at that. Thank you.
Talking about the context of what we've all talked about and all of the different issues and the impacts of what we're living with, especially in rural areas. Lots of times people think about other countries and other worlds, other nations, yet we have other nations within the United States, as I said earlier. And I wanted you to understand that because you've been given the opportunity to get different glimpses, and these are only very tiny glimpses that you've been given here today, because the issues are much greater as you see rural women living in, indigenous women in these rural areas are struggling very hard to maintain and keep who they are, to keep their families intact. We have such high rates of suicide, yet we don't have the resources that are available to help our people. And it's really difficult to see when we've got young ones who are killing themselves, and it just hurts so much. And we're struggling with what can we do to help these young ones? How do we help them? How do we give them hope? How do we help them so that they have the hope of surviving and continuing who we are? We have the high rates of violence that's happening across all parts of the country, and it hits us harder when we've got companies coming in, bringing in outsiders who don't respect our laws, who don't respect our ways, and they feel like they can just do whatever they want. And we're back to those old times that you see in those movies of the Old West, when people just came in, the lawlessness is there, and people have a sense of privilege. And what do we do about that? We have those high rates of diabetes and the high rates of heart disease because of the influx of non-indigenous foods. Yet we have the ability to reclaim our indigenous foods and make ourselves healthy. So it entails a lot more education, and we need that kind of support from everyone out there to make changes in laws to support what we need out there in our rural areas. And I just wanted to get back real quick one more time to look at where we are, because we are, like I said, in the belly of the beast, yet at the same time because we live with all of these laws that are impacting us, lots of times it's very difficult for us to make changes in those laws. And that's where we really need your support to think about how is this impacting the people, the indigenous people of the country. What can we do to make things stronger for them? What can we do to provide support for them? Carmen talked about the Violence Against Women Act. We're trying to get that reauthorized, and we're trying to get the jurisdictional ability that we had to prosecute non-Indians who encroached and who committed crimes in our lands. We're trying to get that back. We had that before the United States passed laws and took it away. So we're trying to get that back, and we need your support to call your Congress people. And we also need to look at and press on the United States and other agencies, if you can, really take a look at the at the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Those lay out the principles that we worked so hard to get passed, and yet we need to put them into practice. We need to incorporate those principles into the laws that we have, into our behaviors with each other. We really need to work hard, and we can do it together. That's the best thing I can say about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women, is that we know our strength is togetherness. The technology and the way the world is changing is impacting our youth, and we have to, as Indigenous women, be mindful about that, because how can we use that to strengthen who we are? How can we use that to strengthen our language? Because our language is on the verge of extinction in a lot of nations. So what are we doing to ensure that that continues? Because the language a lot of times is the only way that we can relate to certain sites, in certain ceremonies, and the songs that we do. And that's so important that we keep that. That's our essence about how we survive and keeps our spirits up. One of the strengths we also have is the voices that we shared and the stories that we shared here today. And I'm glad we had this opportunity.
Yahweh,